this morning, which brings us to the statement on the conflict in Gaza. Foreign Secretary.
Well, with permission, Madam Deputy Speaker, I will make a statement about the conflict in Gaza. In January, I outlined to the House the deal agreed between Israel and Hamas. It was a moment of huge hope and relief in the weeks that followed. Hostages cruelly detained by Hamas were reunited with their families, and aid blocked by Israel finally flooded into Gaza. A path out of this horrendous conflict appeared open. It's therefore as a matter of deep regret to have to update the House today on a breakdown of the ceasefire and yet more bloodshed in Gaza. On the night of the 18th of March, Israel launched airstrikes across Gaza. A number of Hamas figures were reportedly killed, but it's been reported that over 400 Palestinians were killed in missile strikes and artillery barrages. The majority of them were women and children. This appears to have been the deadliest single day for Palestinians since the war began. This is an appalling loss of life, and we mourn the loss of every civilian. Yesterday morning, a UN compound in Gaza was hit. I can confirm to the House that a British national was amongst the wounded. Our priority is supporting them and their family at this time. Gaza has been the most dangerous place in the world to be an aid worker. And I share the outrage of the UN Secretary-General Guterres at this incident. The government calls for a transparent investigation and for those responsible to be held to account. The UK is now working closely with partners such as France and Germany to send a clear message. We strongly oppose Israel's resumption of hostilities. We urgently want to see a return to a ceasefire. More bloodshed is in no one's interests. Hamas must release all the hostages and negotiations must resume. Madam Deputy Speaker, diplomacy is the only way to achieve security for both Israelis and Palestinians. The House will know that the ceasefire in Gaza had lasted for almost 2 months, the result of dogged efforts by Egypt, Qatar and the United States. The deal reached in January saw the nightmare of captivity for 30 hostages and the bodies of 8 further victims of Hamas returned to their loved ones. And we all remember the joy of seeing Emily Damari reunited with her mother and family and the desperately needed aid that had begun to flow back into Gaza. Food, medicines, fuel, tents. Children in Gaza had respite from relentless fear. The severely injured could cross the border again for treatment. Palestinians had begun to return to their homes and consider how to rebuild their lives. In the first days of the ceasefire, the UK moved swiftly to invest in the peace. We released £17 million in additional emergency humanitarian funding for the promised surge in aid. We were bringing our total support this year for Palestinians across the region to £129 million. We accelerated work on the pathway to reconstruction, supporting our Arab partners' very welcome recent initiative. And we worked at every level to support negotiations for a permanent ceasefire and the return of every single hostage, and a backed extension to phase 1 of the current deal. But negotiations have been gridlocked for several weeks. Hamas has been resisting calls for release of further hostages in return for a longer truce. Israeli forces did not begin to withdraw from the Philadelphia corridor as agreed. And on the 2nd of March, the Israeli government announced it was blocking all further aid deliveries until Hamas agreed to its terms. For weeks now, supplies of basic goods and electricity have been blocked, leaving over 500,000 civilians once again cut off from clean drinking water and sparking a 200% surge in the price of some basic foodstuffs, a boon to those criminals who use violence to control supplies. As I told the House on Monday, this is appalling and unacceptable. Ultimately, of course, these are matters for the courts, not governments, to determine. But it's difficult to see how denying humanitarian assistance to a civilian population can be compatible with international humanitarian law. Though it's important to say I could have been a little clearer in the House on Monday, our position remains that Israel's actions in Gaza are a clear risk of breaching international humanitarian law. The consequences of the ceasefire's breakdown, Madam Deputy Speaker, are catastrophic. For the family and friends of the remaining 59 hostages, including Avinatan Or, the agony goes on. Hamas's kidnapping of these people, their treatment of them in captivity, the cruel theatre of their release, depriving them of food and basic rights, these are acts of despicable cruelty. Hamas must release them all now. And Palestinian civilians who have already endured so much now must fear a rerun and a return to days of death, deprivation and destruction. Civilians have once again been issued with evacuation orders by Israel. Only 4% of the United Nations flash appeal is funded, not even enough to get through to the end of this month. Health centres have had to close, even as the devastated Gazan health service has to treat another surge of those wounded in strikes. Madam Deputy Speaker, Hamas can have no role in Gaza's future, but a collapsed ceasefire will not bring the hostages home to their families. An endless conflict will not bring long-term security to Israel, and a deepening war will only set back the cause of regional normalisation and risk further instability. Shortly after the Houthis resume their unacceptable threats to shipping in the Red Sea. Madam Deputy Speaker, since the renewed outbreak of hostilities, I have spoken to Secretary Rubio, to EU High Representative Callas, to the UN Emergency Coordinator Tom Fletcher, and I will shortly speak to my Israeli counterpart Gideon Saar and the Palestinian Prime Minister Mustafa. We and our partners need to persuade the parties that this conflict cannot be resolved by military means. We want Israel and Hamas to re-engage with negotiations. We continue to condemn Hamas, of course, for their actions on October the 7th, for their refusal to release the hostages and their ongoing threat to Israel, but we are also resolute in calling on Israel to abide by international law and to lift the unacceptable restrictions on aid and demand the protection of civilians. Many months ago, only weeks into office, I concluded that there was a clear risk of Israel breaching international humanitarian law in Gaza. It was this risk that I first set out in the House back in September, which meant that the government suspended relevant export licences for items for use by the IDF in military operations in Gaza. The actions of last week only reinforce that conclusion. Madam Deputy Speaker, in the days and weeks ahead, we will redouble our efforts to restore a ceasefire, but we will also continue to work with our partners on the security, governance and reconstruction arrangements. Those issues are not going away. There remains no military solution to this conflict. A two-state solution remains the only path to a just and lasting peace. At this dispatch box in January, I called the ceasefire deal a glimmer of light in the darkness. It feels like the darkness has returned. Former British hostage Emily Damari said the resumption of fighting left her heartbroken, crushed and disappointed. I'm sure she speaks for the whole House, but we must preserve hope for the sake of the remaining hostages and their loved ones, for the people of Gaza, for the future of two peoples that have suffered so much for so long. We will keep striving for a return to the path to peace. I commend this statement to the House.
I call the Shadow Foreign Secretary, Priti Patel.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Foreign Secretary for the advanced side of his statement. We all mourn the loss of innocent lives in this appalling conflict. The death of the UN aid worker and the injury to a British national is tragic, and our sympathies and thoughts are with their families. Can the Foreign Secretary provide an update on the direct engagement he has had with key interlocutors in the region to ascertain the facts around what happened, and has he been updated by the government of Israel on their investigation? The onward transition at the end of Phase 1 of the ceasefire agreement was always going to be challenging. This is a difficult and a really fragile moment for the Middle East. But several basic truths remain unchanged, including the urgency to return to their loved ones, the 59 hostages captured by Hamas terrorists during the atrocities of October the 7th. This is vital for achieving a sustainable end to this horrendous conflict. The incredibly brave families of those held hostage remain firmly in our thoughts, and we should be very clear, the onus is squarely on Hamas. Hamas could agree to release these hostages now and avert any escalation. This is the moment for the UK government to show leadership with the international community to exert maximum pressure on Hamas to release these hostages. Madam Deputy Speaker, we should all fully understand who we are dealing with here. A brutal Iranian-backed terrorist organisation that seeks the destruction of the world's only Jewish state, which uses its own defenceless people as human shields, and which has ruthlessly eradicated fundamental freedoms in Gaza. Anyone who has read the shocking report from Lord Roberts and commissioned by the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Israel on October the 7th would have seen the harrowing details of the real-life consequences of Hamas, complete with a total disdain of their human dignity and the utter disregard for human life, visceral anti-Semitism and murderous intentions. The organised brutality, murder, rape and torture, indiscriminately targeting babies, children, women and the elderly. As the Prime Minister himself once said, Hamas bears responsibility. Is that still the Prime Minister's and the government's position? Madam Deputy Speaker, it is abundantly clear that Iranian-backed Hamas can have no role in the future of Gaza, and we have raised this many times in this House. So what exactly is the British government doing at this moment in time to bear down on Hamas, work with partners to put an end to this brutal regime? What assessment has he made of the capabilities of Hamas and the ongoing threat the terrorists pose to peace and stability in the region? Does the government support the US proposal for securing the release of hostages? What is his vision of the next steps? Does he believe the Phase 2 of the ceasefire remains within reach, or is he considering alternative solutions? There is too much at stake for Britain to be a bystander. We must be a proactive player with involvement. The Foreign Secretary mentioned his talks with France and Germany, but what discussions is he having with Egypt and other regional partners? We need Israel to continue seeing the UK as a trusted partner. The strength of Britain's relationship with Israel also matters for our wider influence in the Middle East. If we undermine our relationship and influence with Israel, we also lose influence across the Middle East. Careless comments do not help, including the Foreign Secretary's remarks of this House on Monday, for which has been rebuked by the Prime Minister. So will he apologise to the House and to Israel? The Foreign Secretary's focus should be on securing the release of the 59 remaining hostages, and this House should be united in that. Those hostages are held by Hamas since the atrocities of October the 7th, which is important and sustainable to end this conflict. Let's be clear, Hamas has no respect for international law, human life or human rights. So does the Foreign Secretary agree that we must be unequivocal that there is no moral equivalence between Hamas and the democratically elected government of Israel, and we must have no more poorly judged decisions on arms exports designed to placate his backbenchers? On the question of aid to Gaza, which perhaps the backbenchers would like to take seriously, I have said from this dispatch before that we expect detail about the government's practical response on the ground. How is the government working to unblock the situation? And what is happening to British aid that is already in the region or en route? What discussions has he had with Israeli counterparts in recent days? What is his assessment of the reports of Hamas stockpiling aid and the impact this has on distribution to civilians in need? Has he held discussions recently with the Red Cross on their very important work on hostage release and aid delivery? Can we be doing more to support the ICRC's work here? And on the region more broadly, as the Parliamentary Commission report makes crystal clear, we cannot ignore the role of the regime in Tehran, which has its fingerprints over so much of this inhumane suffering and bloodshed that we see today. We need action to deter Iran's malign agenda. So what options are on the table to tackle Iran and the flow of weapons and support to their terrorist proxies? What hard power options is he considering in respect to the Houthis? I did not receive answers on Monday in this House on that. I asked the Foreign Secretary on Monday as well whether Britain is in lockstep with the United States, but he did not answer that. So now is the time for him to provide clarity and clear answers.
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady, and let me just make clear on the charity worker who was injured that, of course, our ambassador and the Foreign Office are in touch with his family, and as she would expect, we have made representations to the Israeli government, and I will be speaking to the Israeli Foreign Minister in the coming hours. She talks about Hamas, and I have said at this dispatch box that the scenes of those young men in balaclavas with Kalashnikovs parading hostages are obscene, and I condemn them. I said in January that we would continue to stand with the hostage families, and we will. There are still dozens of families waiting, hoping, praying that their loved ones can return. But I tell her too that she will have seen overnight that there are many of those families saying this is not the way to bring them home. They fear that as a consequence of this resumed action, their loved ones will perish. And so I thought the tone of some of her remarks did not sit with what I see coming out of Israel at this side. No one could not be absolutely touched and affected by the gaunt and malnourished hostages paraded around in a sick propaganda exercise. We all condemn Hamas. But I tell her too, when she asks what we are doing, and actually what the last government did, is we are supporting the Palestinian Authority with reform, because there has to be an alternative to Hamas, and the alternative to Hamas is the Palestinian Authority. And we've got to work with them. You've got to give people hope and prospect that isn't about terrorism. And that is about supporting Prime Minister Mustafa in all of his efforts, particularly, and that is what we've been doing, and that is why we've been working with the Arab Quint particularly. There was to be, she asked me about how we're working with partners in the area, there was to be a conference, a gathering in Egypt this weekend. It has been postponed, but it will be very important that we attend that gathering and work with our Arab partners. And I put on record our support of Egypt and Qatar in their conversations with Hamas. She knows that we don't talk to Hamas, but we do work with those partners who can. She asked me about future operations in the Red Sea, and she knows very well that I would never comment from this dispatch box about operational issues in the Red Sea. She asked me if there's any moral equivalence between Hamas and the Israeli government. Of course there's no moral equivalence between Hamas and the Israeli government. None of us have ever suggested that is the case. And she asked me quite rightly about the role of Iran, and she's right about the malign effect of Iran in the region, and we will act to ensure that they do not get the nuclear capability that they are seeking to secure. And this was an issue that I discussed with Secretary of State Rubio and my counterparts in France and in Germany.
Select Committee Chair Emily Thornberry.
Can I begin by thanking the Foreign Secretary for his passionate and articulate plea for peace from the dispatch box. In doing so, I know that he speaks for all of us, and I know that he has witnessed the suffering and feels it very deeply, as we all do. The renewed bombing in Gaza cannot be justified. The renewed siege of Gaza cannot be justified, and it is difficult to see how that is compatible. Either of those are compatible with international law. It will be for a court to decide, and there will be a reckoning. The question is, though, what's going to happen now? Because whatever it is that the British government is doing in the region, it is clearly not working. So the question is, what is Plan B? What is Plan B? Now that the Israeli government has abandoned the fragile course of peace, what is Plan B for the West Bank, which still faces the threat of annexation, and following reports of these strikes, that those strikes may have American endorsement? What is Plan B when it comes to uniting our international allies to make sense of this senseless violation of the peace process? That we need to make sure that it is met not just with words, no matter how passionate and no matter how articulate. We have to do something, and we need to do something internationally and with our allies. Now is the time to stop talking about it and do something.
Well, I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Lady, and I know that she was in the region very recently and discussing these very same issues at the Knesset. And let me say to her that the US envoy, Steve Witkoff, I understand, is flying into the area as we speak. And I hold out hope that we can still get to a ceasefire once more that gets us to the plan, which was to the end of the Passover period, and I can't give up hope on that. She says we've got to have more than words. She knows, as I do, that the business of diplomacy is words, is conversations, is using our influence to bring this about. And that's why we're working very closely with the United States, with our Arab partners, and of course with E3 partners particularly, and the European Union at this time. And I will do everything I can to get us back to that ceasefire.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Helen Maguire.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and to the Minister for the advance sight of this statement. Israel resuming its military campaign in Gaza is heartbreaking for all Palestinians, for the remaining hostages and their families, and for the world. For 2 months, the fragile ceasefire provided space for the release of hostages, and until early March, the flooding of Gaza with vital aid to alleviate the suffering of Palestinians. The resumption of fighting now threatens the lives of both the Israeli hostages, still held in captivity by Hamas, and Palestinians who have already seen their homes and communities devastated by 15 months of war. A new ceasefire must be secured as soon as possible. To this end, what discussions has the Foreign Secretary had with the Israeli government on rapidly recommitting to a ceasefire? Even before the resumption of military operations, the Israeli government had to cut aid routes into Gaza, as well as the supply of electricity. This was illegal and wrong, contravening Israel's obligations under international law. In this House on Monday and today, the Foreign Secretary stated that Israel's aid blockade was a breach of international law. Will the Foreign Secretary outline what action he is taking to ensure there are consequences to breaching international law? Hamas must also now immediately and unconditionally release the remaining hostages, the treatment of whom while in captivity has been despicable. We're also deeply concerned by reports that a British bomb disposal expert has been injured in an explosion at a UN facility in the Strip, and our thoughts are with their family. Can the Foreign Secretary also update the House on his safety and condition? Arab states have a vital role to play in supporting the transition back to a state of ceasefire. Their plan to the reconstruction of Gaza also provides a pragmatic proposal for rebuilding the Strip, particularly when compared to the reckless proposals put forward by Trump, who described his intention to remove Palestinians from Gaza. Can the Foreign Secretary confirm that he has engaged closely with Arab partners in the region around their plans for reconstruction? As conflict returns to Gaza, we also need to give Palestinians hope and show them that we support their right to statehood. Does the Foreign Secretary agree with me that the UK must now move to officially recognise a state of Palestine as a vital part of a two-state solution which offers dignity and security to Palestinians and Israelis?
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady. Since the renewed outbreak of hostilities, can I assure her that I've spoken to Secretary Rubio, I've spoken to EU High Representative Kai Kallas, and we're closely coordinated. I met with the Emergency Relief Coordinator, Tom Fletcher, in New York just last Friday, and we were discussing the issues in Gaza. And of course, I expect to speak to my counterpart, Gideon Saar, and Palestinian Prime Minister Mustafa very shortly. We're working very closely with our E3 partners particularly, and she will also have seen that there was a closed meeting of the United Nations Security Council on Tuesdays, in which we made strong representations. She'll also be aware that these issues were discussed, and she'll have seen the communique that flowed from the G7 Foreign Ministers meeting last week in Canada. As I have now said on 10 occasions since September, Israel's actions in Gaza are a clear risk, or at a clear risk, of breaching international humanitarian law. The government's been clear all along that we're not an international court, and we could not make a judgment as to whether Israel has breached international humanitarian law. But I made a decision back in September based on whether there was a clear risk, and for that reason we have suspended those sales to Gaza, and they'll continue to be suspended. And let me tell her also that in relation to the British hostages, we are in relation to the British charity worker who has been wounded, we are of course in contact with his family, and I intend to keep the House updated.
Melanie Ward.
Deputy Speaker. And I want to say thank you to the Foreign Secretary for all the work that he and his team are doing behind the scenes on this horrific issue. And I have to say it's quite shocking that the Shadow Foreign Secretary appears unable to say the word Palestinian. And as someone who used to be an international aid worker and was in Gaza, I want to say that the lives of Palestinian aid workers are every bit as valuable as the lives of international aid workers. And more than 170 Palestinian children have been killed this week alone. And yesterday, the Israeli Defence Minister threatened the ethnic cleansing of Gaza.
Question, then I will assist. Please carry on with the question.
Yesterday, the Israeli Defence Minister threatened the ethnic cleansing of Gaza. What action is the Foreign Secretary taking to stop this and to hold the government of Israel accountable for its actions?
Well, can I say to the Honourable Lady that humanitarian aid should never be used as a political tool, and Israel must restart the aid immediately. This is a time when a lot of diplomatic activity is going on. As I said, Steve Witkoff, the envoy, has flown into the area, and we are in touch with the US. I am closely working with E3 and the EU. In fact, I will be speaking very shortly to my French counterpart. We have not given up hope. I sense that there has been a loss of hope in this chamber that we can get back to a ceasefire, but I'm telling you now, this Foreign Secretary has not given up hope that we can get back to a ceasefire. It's my job to try and do the best to deliver that, and that is what I intend to do over the coming hours.
Is the point of order absolutely relevant right now? Priti Patel.
I seek your advice, Madam Deputy Speaker, on just the clarification on the misrepresentation that I have not spoken about the Palestinian Authority in this House at the dispatch box when I have on a number of occasions, Madam Deputy Speaker.
We need to make sure can we please be seated? This is a very sensitive and important debate. We need to make sure that language is tempered and respectful at all times. Our constituents and indeed the world is watching, and we need to make sure that we are not in any way inadvertently misrepresenting each other and our colleagues. But it is noted, but we will now continue. We have a lot of people to get through. Father of the House.
I agree with everything the Foreign Secretary has said, and particularly we have to give hope to the Palestinian people. To be fair to the Israeli government position, Hamas could solve this now if they release the hostages. But having said that, it is surely wrong, would the Foreign Secretary agree that it is quite wrong for anybody in the Israeli government to say that the Gazan people could rise up against Hamas? If you do that, you'll best be tortured or probably killed. The people of Gaza are victims of Hamas as much as anybody. And it is quite wrong for the Israeli government to inflict collective judgment on the people of Gaza. This will bring death, destruction, more radicalism, and will never get the hostages home.
Well, the Father of the House speaks with tremendous authority. And that is why I've said, look, none of us stand with Hamas. All of us want to see Hamas removed. But you have to provide an alternative to Hamas. And it seems to me that alternative is the Palestinian Authority and working alongside people to undermine Hamas. We also have to see the end of Hamas, and there are ways. We did it in Northern Ireland with de-arming. There are ways to bring this about, but they are best done through diplomatic and political solutions, not military endeavour.
Imran Hussain.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The double standards and injustice we are witnessing on the international stage is truly appalling. It's obvious that Israel is breaking international law, as every serious legal expert on international law has pointed out. And it's shameful, frankly, that the government refuses to state that about Israel, but will rightly do so about Russia's violation in Ukraine. And I say to the Foreign Secretary, the concern and outrage he expresses at the dispatch box is not ending the bloodshed. When will we get the scale of sanctions on Israel that its war crimes demand?
What can I say to the honourable gentleman? The conflict has gone on for 526 painful days. And I recognise the strength of feeling after more than 49,000 people have been killed in Gaza. It's a staggering amount of people. He would not expect me to, from this dispatch box, comment on any further sanctions. But of course we keep these issues under close review.
Malthouse.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, it's been estimated that in the opening salvos of this appalling aggression, the Israelis killed 80 Palestinian children in the space of 51 minutes. There have been reports of children going through amputations without anaesthetics due to the blockade. And of course, it's been reported that leaflets were dropped across Gaza last night threatening extermination. Surely, even for the government, the Israelis have now crossed a monstrous red line. Now, the Foreign Secretary talks about equivalence. I'm assuming that he believes that the Palestinian civilians and their lives are equivalent to the lives of Israeli citizens and also are equivalent to the lives of Ukrainian citizens. This morning, ministers were out on the airwaves offering British troops to keep the peace between Ukraine and Russia. What is it about the Palestinian people that means they're less deserving of that kind of protection?
A whole generation of Gazans are growing up in the most unbearable conditions, and I know that the honourable gentleman has been a champion of those children who we saw rummaging around in the rubble, children who are now orphaned. So many, thousands of children in Gaza out of school. So it's absolutely right that he brings their plight to this House. But the way forward we were shown back at the beginning of January, which is a ceasefire, negotiations to getting to phase 2, getting to phase 3, and a horizon to a two-state solution. That is what I will continue to fight for.
Creasy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think we all share the Foreign Secretary's shock and anger and frustration at the breakdown of the ceasefire and the deaths that we are seeing in Gaza. And as today's debate shows, words do matter. I want to follow up on the comments from my colleague from Cowdenbeath, given that we are now hearing reports that there are ground activities happening in Gaza led by the Israeli forces. Israel Katz, the Defence Minister, claimed that evacuation of Gaza would resume, and he is threatening the total devastation. These are not the actions of a government that wants peace. They are the actions of an increasingly authoritarian government, more interested in their own political survival than the survival of any innocent civilian, be they Palestinian or Israeli. This is not what the hostage families want to see, and we should speak for them as much, for the innocent civilians in Gaza, the Palestinians whose lives are being lost. Can the Foreign Secretary be clear, for avoidance of doubt, that we do not agree with, we condemn the words of Israel Katz, not as they are not going to bring forward the ceasefire, they're not going to uphold international law if they are left unchallenged?
I do condemn those words, and I would ask Minister Katz, who's very experienced, to withdraw them.
Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The language that we use in this conflict matters. We know what has happened, and the Foreign Secretary has reminded us today. For weeks, supplies of basic goods and electricity have been blocked. So to say that Israel, having done that, risks breaching international law is to say that the position of this country, and this is how it will be heard in Tel Aviv, does not see these acts as a prima facie breach of international law. Is that really the government's position?
Yeah. The government's position is based on the law that was set out in our export licensing regime, which the Honourable Gentleman supported in the last Parliament. And the language of that legislation, if he looks at it closely, is that I, as Minister, on behalf of the government, have to make an assessment of clear risk. That is the language that I've used 10 times in this House since September. I stand by it, and so should the Honourable Gentleman.
Speaker, and I want to thank the Foreign Secretary for his statement and his absolute commitment to the end of the fighting in Gaza, to the return of the hostages, and to ultimately a two-state solution. But I do want to say to him that I am contacted by constituents of all backgrounds, of all faiths and none. They stop me in the streets and they see the mutilated bodies of babies. They see the consequences of the blockade on humanitarian aid. And they say to me, what is this government doing about it? What am I doing about it? So will he say to my constituents now, what action the British government will take in response to Israel's actions in Gaza and the West Bank?
And let me make clear, when she talks about the horrors in Gaza, she should reassure her constituents that the United Kingdom announced £129 million of funding for the occupied territories just in the last year, and that included £41 million for UNRWA, that we're very clear that humanitarian aid should not be used as a tool, and that, of course, UK support has meant over 500,000 people have received essential health care. 647,000 of them have received food, and 284,000 people have improved access to water, sanitation, and hygiene as a result of the British taxpayer. In terms of what we're doing, I've been in this House 25 years. The Honourable Lady knows that this is about diplomacy. It's about diplomacy. I wish that I could switch this off from this dispatch box. She knows full well I can't do that, but what I can do is engage in the issues in detail. It's hard grind. I know this is hard for many in this House, but that is how you bring about a ceasefire.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And my right honourable friend, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, mentioned the all-party parliamentary group report on the atrocities committed on the 7th of October 2023, brilliantly researched by Lord Roberts and a whole series of different individuals. This is a document almost 500 pages long, and it contains the evidence of what happened, not only on that day, but also subsequently. I would commend it to the Foreign Secretary to read. In future, this will be the definitive history of what happened on the 7th of October. Could he, therefore, look at the fact that we have 59 hostages still in captivity? It's understood that only 24 are alive, and probably only barely alive if they are, and 35 dead. The reality is there is an opportunity for the deal as proposed by the United States, for a ceasefire to continue, for the release of the hostages, and for Hamas to lay down their arms. That is still open to the terrorists in Hamas to take up. And if they do so, we can then all unite across the House and call for the end of death and destruction.
Well, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for mentioning those hostages. The question is now, how do we get those remaining hostages home? And is the action that we've seen in the last 2 to 3 days likely to bring them home, or is it likely to see more of them perish? And I want to stand with the many hostage families who say, can we give the talks a chance to succeed? Because I do think that military action is unlikely to bring them home.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We've all been absolutely horrified to see the devastating impact of Israel's military airstrikes, and the Foreign Secretary rightly said it's an appalling and unacceptable loss of life, and that our Labour government opposes the resumption of hostilities. Does the Foreign Secretary agree with me that there is no military solution to this conflict?
Let me state again, there is no military solution to this conflict. It's a conflict that's gone on for 17 months. Had there been a military solution, it would have been found by now. The way forward is a political process and getting back to those ceasefire negotiations.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The inhumanity and the depravity that we witnessed on Tuesday defies belief. But what it does show is that after 17 months, Israel understands fully what impunity is, because Netanyahu shattered that fragile ceasefire, killing 400 civilians sheltering in tents, mostly babies and toddlers, knowing that there would be absolutely no consequence for his action. So could the Foreign Secretary tell me, can he think of any other conflict at any other point in history when the UK would have accepted one of its closest allies and one of its closest military partners designating babies and toddlers as legitimate military targets?
Can I just say to the Honourable Gentleman that the whole House will have heard his language. I think the whole House also understands that this is one of the most complex of atrocities. There are atrocities on both sides of this conflict, and I just remind him of the scenes of those murdered horrendously on October the 7th. What we need now is more light and less heat.
Matthew Patrick.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This ceasefire must be desperately salvaged for the 59 hostages who they and their families have lived through hell for 530 days now, but also for the innocent people of Gaza who need aid and need safety and security and themselves have lived through hell through that time. Hamas, I worry, they state they want to repeat the actions of October 7th. They are committed only to endless war. What can this government do to ensure they have no role in the future of Gaza?
Well, let me say to the Honourable Gentleman that reports have come in that Hamas has now started firing rockets into Israel, and sirens are at this time sounding in Tel Aviv. I condemn Hamas's rocket attacks, and I want to reiterate that the only way through this is to get back to a ceasefire. It's unacceptable that Israeli civilians are running for cover and Palestinian civilians are finding that the casualties are rising. There can be no place for Hamas in the future of Gaza, and that's why we're doing everything to help the reform of the Palestinian Authority, and we believe that they must play a role in Gaza's governance in the months and years ahead.
Desmond Swain.
Despite a huge investment in our relationship with Israel over so many years, we appear to be reduced to the position of spectators on a touchline, shouting at the players and being largely ignored. To what extent does the Secretary of State believe, if any, that our lack of leverage is a consequence of policy decisions taken in Washington?
Well, I think it's clear that the efforts of US Envoy Steve Witkoff and President Trump did bring us to a place where we'd got a ceasefire. And I might say that it sometimes can feel futile. Diplomacy can feel very hard. The words of parliamentarians can feel like they had no effect. But everything that every single one of us as members of Parliament did in those 17 months also led to that ceasefire in January. We wish we could have brought it about sooner, and now we must act to get back to that ceasefire as quickly as possible.
We're introduced.
Madam Deputy Speaker, it is obvious that by us saying that we strongly oppose hostilities and that we are appalled by Israel's action is having absolutely no effect on Netanyahu, who said at the death of 400 Palestinians, most of whom were women and children, that this was only the beginning. It is not right that the ordinary people of Palestine should suffer because of the actions of Hamas. Does the Foreign Secretary agree that we now need to send a stronger message to Israel and go further, perhaps by suspending all arms licenses to Israel and by recognising the State of Palestine?
Let me say to the Honourable Gentleman, we are 3 days into a resumption of fighting. 3 days too long, and I have lamented in my statement and numerous times already in the Chamber the loss of life. But 3 days means that there is more diplomacy that we can deploy to get that ceasefire back, and that is what I intend to do over the coming hours and days.
Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State for his statement? It's never easy to come to the Chamber and make a statement on something as incredibly complex. We all watched with horror as Israeli prisoners were released, not in a sombre, dignified release, but instead paraded about as an example of the control that Hamas had. As far as Hamas were concerned, they weren't human beings, but instead they were trophies of abuse and hate. Those scenes were etched into the minds of people throughout the world, and will the Secretary of State confirm the fact that now, as much as ever, Israel must show her strength and her friends, and to show Hamas to be the murderous scum that they are? And will the Secretary of State reaffirm his pledge to support those who stand against the evil personified by the Hamas terrorists?
Well, I'm very grateful for what the Honourable Gentleman has said, and let me once again condemn Hamas, condemn their activities and condemn them for not releasing those hostages from this dispatch box. That is the way out of this. Release the hostages. Let us get back to a political process, get back to ceasefire, and stop firing rockets into Israel.
Nestle Kalshkan.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I take the opportunity to thank the Foreign Secretary and his team for what I know are personal efforts, diplomatic efforts to play the UK government's part in making sure that we can return to a ceasefire. But in the last few days, hundreds of more women and children have been killed in Gaza. We've now had confirmation from the Foreign Secretary that a British national aid worker, UN aid worker, has been wounded, and aid continues to be blocked. The hope for Palestinians is moving far away. Can I ask the Foreign Secretary to further reiterate his commitment around the diplomatic efforts of this government, but also to give us a sense of what the UK government is doing at this moment, where there is such darkness for the Palestinian people, where they think about what may be coming in the coming days, so that we can very quickly not only return to a ceasefire, but a longer-term hope for that region.
Well, the Honourable Lady asked what we're doing. I, alongside my G7 partners, and I would refer her to the communiqué there was a lengthy section on the situation in Gaza discussing this with 7 other of our closest partners. I then flew to New York to meet with Tom Fletcher to discuss the situation on the ground. I met with our colleague in the European Union, Kaja Kallas, just this week to discuss these very same issues, and I know that she intends to be in the region to discuss these issues face-to-face with Israeli counterparts. She would have seen the work of our UN ambassador, Barbara Woodward, in the UN. There was a closed session where, of course, they were discussing with intensity these very same issues. So I want to reassure her that all efforts are going in, and, of course, we stand alongside the supporting the reform of the Palestinian Authority. It's why I'll be speaking to Prime Minister Mustafa a little later today.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a tragic fact that military conflicts, wherever they occur, result in the death of innocent civilians, and among them many children. And we witness this day in, day out on our TV screens. Israel has an absolute right to take action to recover the hostages, but I agree with the Foreign Secretary that the continuing bombardment of Gaza of itself will not achieve that. Indeed, would he agree with me that one thing it does achieve, it risks radicalising the younger generation to become the Hamas supporters of the future?
Well, that is the huge concern, because we want to provide hope for these people, and we want to provide an alternative to Hamas. And I just repeat, after 17 months of bombardment, if it was going to work, it would have worked. It hasn't worked. And to go back to that, as night follows day, at the end of any military exercise, Hamas will still be there, and you'll still come back to a political process. So let us continue with the political process and the ceasefire talks now. Let's extend phase 1 to the end of the Ramadan Passover season, and let us work hard to get to phase 2.
Salami.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This ceasefire provided a glimmer of hope, as the Foreign Secretary mentioned, for the innocent civilians fleeing the constant bombardment, the bloodshed. It provided hope for the innocent hostages waiting desperately to be reunited with their families. And to see Israel breach this is indefensible. The targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure should not be justified under any circumstances. I thank the Foreign Secretary for the work that he's doing and the personal efforts he's leading behind the scenes, including the recent statement with the UK, Germany and French foreign ministers. And as the Foreign Secretary knows, leadership requires that honesty with your friends and telling things how they are. And will the Foreign Secretary commit to the UK showing leadership in providing that international clarity to end this cycle of violence, and clarity on this really serious area around international law breaches?
Well, I commend my honourable friend for bringing her moral clarity to the Chamber this afternoon. And yes, of course, I can confirm that we will continue to do all we can, and we stand by the judgments that we made back in September when we assessed that there was a clear risk of a breach of humanitarian law.
Ellie Childs.
Thank you, Madam President. Israel is committing war crimes in Gaza, blocking the entry of humanitarian aid, cutting electricity essential for drinking water, forced displacement of civilians, and now indiscriminate bombing, killing and maiming many children. These are not just clear risks of breach of humanitarian law, they are clear breaches. Yep. And it's just not enough to say we don't like it. Yep. So can I ask the Secretary of State a very specific question? Has he explicitly asked the Israeli government whether any UK-made arms or arms components were used in the mass airstrikes in recent days that broke the ceasefire and have caused untold suffering for civilians?
Well, can I say to the Honourable Lady that in making our assessment on a clear risk of a breach of humanitarian law, we suspended arms sales. to Israel. That is what we did, and I stand by that decision.
Paul Wall.
Madam Deputy Speaker, of the 170 children killed in Israel's deadly day of bombing in Gaza on Tuesday, 3 of them were brothers, and they were sons of Karem Tariq Hamid. Hassan, who was 9, Mohammed, aged 8, and Aziz, who was just 5. They used to play around and have fun, their father told the BBC. They wanted to be doctors, teachers. I'm the father of 3 sons too, and it disgusts me that actually Israel's actions seem to somehow treat Palestinian children's lives as somehow more expendable, less precious than Israeli children's lives. So isn't it time we had a diplomatic coalition of the willing, maybe starting with the E3 of the UK, France and Germany, to say not just through actions but words, not just words but actions, actually how we're going to call out Israel's appalling crimes in Gaza?
Well, can I say to the honourable gentleman that as the father of an adopted child, I feel personally the plight of the many, many children in Gaza that have been orphaned, the many children that are subject to exploitation as a result that they now have no parents. And it breaks my heart that amongst those who are now injured, who are now bereft, who have lost their parents, that more horrors could have been deployed on them. So I understand the strength of his feeling, and it's why I'm doing all I can with E3 partners particularly to try and halt this behaviour.
Julian Lewis.
Has the government received any indication or formed any view about what the current Israeli government would do if, admittedly against all expectation, Hamas were to release all the hostages forthwith?
Well, that's a very good question, and it's certainly a matter that I have discussed with the United States envoy, Steve Witkoff, and indeed I've discussed with the Israeli government. He will know there's a lot of politics in Israel. And it's my sincere hope that these judgments are not being guided by political calculation when they cut to the core of human life. And I say to those in Israel, listen to those hostage families. Listen to the way out of this. Let's get back to a ceasefire, because I'm quite sure at the end of any military exercise, the risk is less hostages will be alive. And anyway, you will have to get back to negotiation, because military endeavour will not see the end of Hamas.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I think we have all been shocked and horrified to see the escalation in Gaza over the last few days. I thank the Foreign Secretary for his words today, and I just want to ask him what work he's doing both with the international community but also directly with the Israeli government to lift the blockade on aid to ensure that he can get to the Palestinian people, particularly given the escalations we've seen in recent days.
Well, the Honourable Lady is right. We've got to lift the blockade on aid, particularly, and that's why we've increased our funding at this time, and that we will be working closely with partners in the region to get that aid in. But let me also just take this opportunity. I remember meeting with the families of 3 British workers killed in the World Central Kitchen attack, John Chapman, James Kirby and James Henderson. It's nearly a year since that attack, and they want and deserve justice. And there are many other families, many Palestinians, more than 350, who've lost their loved ones, also killed in this conflict. We cannot see the continued killing of aid workers in any conflict, and we condemn it in this House.
Chris Law.
Madam Speaker, I'd like to begin with a quote. Annihilate, smash, eradicate, erase, crush, shatter, burn, be cruel, punish, ruin, crush, annihilate. Madam Deputy Speaker, this is the genocidal voice of the Israeli government, as posted on X only last night by Itamar Ben-Gvir as he is reappointed as Cabinet Minister. Foreign Secretary recognised this week that Israel is in breach of international law. So what further evidence does the Prime Minister need to recognise this and for the UK Government to end its complicity in these crimes by stopping support from the Israeli Government committing atrocities against the Palestinian peoples?
Well, if those are the words that were used last night, and I haven't seen them all, then I condemn them categorically from this dispatch box.
Matt Weston.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Foreign Secretary for his update. It is clearly appalling what we're seeing. The signals are absolutely clear coming from the Defence Minister Katz. They seek total destruction of Gaza, and they see the occupation of West Bank as being their objectives. The leverage over Netanyahu's government is from Ben-Gvir and from Smotrich. So my question is really simple, and that is, other than reviewing all the arms slices once again, or maybe withdrawing them, and the sanctions against Israel, what leverage does the UK government have over Israel in this circumstance?
Well, I can't comment on future sanction designations, but I refer him to the sanctions that I announced back in October, with raising concerns particularly about settlements, the settle of violence particularly in the West Bank. And I condemn the expansion, more expansion this year than we've seen in any other year. And I want to reassure him that we keep sanctions closely under review.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Millions around the world saw last night in real time the destruction of life, loss of children's lives and more destruction, and the Israeli attempt to annex northern Gaza, if not the whole of Gaza, because that is clearly what the whole agenda is about. And Israel continues to commit war crimes by the denial of food, water and electricity to the people of Gaza. Will the British government actually confirm they're in breach of international law? And secondly, will we cease all military cooperation with Israel, arms supplies and the use of RAF Akrotiri as a staging point for the delivery of weapons?
Well, can I condemn any attempts to annex Gaza or attempts to annex the West Bank? And I know that this is an issue that the Honourable Gentleman, Right Honourable Gentleman, has raised in the past. It wouldn't be appropriate for me to comment on operational military matters, but I've been absolutely clear that our assessment, and it's why on the legislation that he supported and that I supported, that was put through this House under the last government, that my assessment was that there was a clear risk that there is a breach of international humanitarian law. And I just remind the House, gently as a lawyer, that that assessment actually of a clear risk is a pretty, it's a low standard, but yet on the assessments that I made, that I saw, that I've seen, and I continue to see, that is my assessment. And so therefore, I think the Honourable Gentleman should be comforted that we are not assisting in what we are seeing in Gaza.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I correct my right honourable friend when he uses the word both sides, because neither the Israeli government nor Hamas represent the interests of the Palestinian people, and I think we need to recognise that they themselves do not have the voice that is necessary to bring them the protection that they need. However, I just want to raise the issue around the definition of genocide. Many times from the dispatch box, my right honourable friend has rightly said that it is for the courts to determine whether or not a genocide has been committed. Could he say what efforts he has made to ask the courts to make such ruling?
Well, of course, as the Honourable Lady probably knows, I do meet from time to time with those that lead our international humanitarian law architecture, the ICC particularly, and the ICJ. These are constitutional matters for them, and we must stand by the separation of powers, and therefore it's right that they get on and do their proper work and we as politicians make our judgments, but we are not courts. We cannot, from this dispatch box, pronounce, certainly not on behalf of governments. Of course, in a free democracy, backbenchers are free to say whatever they feel in this House, and that must be proper. But on behalf of a government, it must be right that courts make those determinations.
Anne Davies.
Fawr, Madam Dirprwy Llefarydd. The latest scenes coming out of Gaza are truly horrifying. UNICEF say that the reported killing earlier this week of more than 130 children would be the largest single-day child death toll in the last year. And as a mum, and as a mumgy, or even as a human being actually, I find that truly abhorrent. Is the Minister comfortable with the possibility of UK arms being used by Israel against children? And if not, will he end, not postpone, will he end all sales arms immediately?
Well, I refer to the Honourable Lady to what I've already said and to my statement back in September and my reassurance that we are absolutely not in the business at the moment of selling arms that could be used in Gaza under our licensing decisions, save, of course, for the decision that we made on F-35s, and that is because in looking at the supply chain and recognising risks and conflict also in other parts of the world, including in the Euro-Atlantic, we had to make some very serious judgments.
Mr. Speaker, failing to act in the face of Israel breaking ceasefire in so violent a manner has consequences. It undercuts moderate voices in Israel, damages the UK's reputation internationally, and compromises our support for international law and for the rule of law. Will the Foreign Secretary look again at government policy on recognition, sanctions, trade and arms supply, while atrocities continue against Palestinian civilians?
Well, I'm grateful for the honourable gentleman, particularly on raising the issue of recognition, which I know is an issue dearly felt by him and others in this House. It's a serious issue. He knows that recognition in of itself does not deliver a two-state solution. He knows that we do want to see a two-state solution, and we do want to see the recognition of a Palestinian state, but that is best done as part of a process that actually gets us to those two states. And he will recognise that notwithstanding the decision by other partners to move to recognition, that has not alleviated the suffering that we're seeing in front of our eyes. And that's why it's a careful balance. I recognise different governments and different members will come to a different judgment on this. But as I say, I am holding out for those two states and an actual state for the Palestinian people, a just cause, not just for a symbolic act.
Shaukat Adam.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I, along with 1 billion Muslims around the world, began my fast on Tuesday morning, not with just some food and water, but with the screams of 400 innocent men, women and children ringing in our ears as they were burnt alive in their makeshift tents. I take objection to the fact of this resuming of conflict or the cessation of the peace deal. The Israelis have continued to kill people, hundreds, including freezing babies, and the Gazification of the West Bank with the removal of 40,000 people. The Minister will also be aware of the peace deal that was available in May 2024, which, according to President Biden, the Israelis' hostages are not a priority for them. A sentiment that was echoed by the Hostage and Missing Families Forum just the other day, who accused Mr. Netanyahu of complete deception, and the Israeli government has chosen to abandon the hostages. The fact is the Foreign Secretary is aware of all this. He is aware of all this as we continue to provide military support and our air bases in Cyprus, as we continue to give moral, economic and political support. So can I ask the Minister, and take this as it sincerely meant, the Minister who has passionately spoken about his heritage and his ancestors who were shackled in the chains of slavery, to unshackle his own chains and to immediately seize all arms licences and, despite the £6.1 billion economic ties, to impose economic sanctions and put in place a viable process of recognising the state of Palestine.
Well, the Honourable Gentleman brings powerful rhetoric to this House this afternoon, but let me say to him that notwithstanding the horrors of the conflict that has begun, we are 3 days into that conflict, and it's my job to use all endeavours I can to get back to that ceasefire. And in the end, it's that ceasefire that will bring an alleviation to the suffering. That is my job, and that is what I intend to do.
Laura Kirk-Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In recent weeks, I've heard relief from my constituents, but also fear of this exact moment that we're now in. I thank the Foreign Secretary for all the work he's been doing to secure a lasting peace, and I am glad to hear him speak today of the need to send a clear message to Israel that the resumption of airstrikes is unacceptable. I do worry that this message will only be heard if it's conveyed through words and through actions. And I'd like to ask the Foreign Secretary to reassure my constituents that he is looking at what further actions may be needed, including on sanctions, to get back on the path to peace.
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for her remarks. I can't comment on further action or sanctions that from this dispatch box. I just pray and aid what I've already said about diplomatic efforts, and I hope we can see the resumption of a ceasefire as soon as possible. And I wish my colleague, US Envoy Steve Witkoff, all power to him in the coming days as he seeks to use the US influence to bring that to pass.
Deputy Speaker, I'm grateful to the Foreign Secretary for having made time to meet me so I could share some of the concerns outlined by many people in Newcastle under Lyme. And I do just want to say that nobody has a monopoly on decency and compassion, and some members in this House ought to keep that in mind. The scenes on our TV screens from Gaza have been beyond horrifying. The breaking of the ceasefire has seen more innocent people killed. Now, without question, we need all hostages to be released, and we need this war to end now. So can I ask the Foreign Secretary what specific discussions he's had with his counterparts in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan and the rest, in the noble aim of saving the lives of innocent people and delivering the long overdue two-state solution we desperately need?
Well, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Gentleman. I met with many partners at the G20 a few weeks ago, and as he will know, I've also spoken to many partners from the Arab Quint, particularly on the phone, and I suspect that I will be in the region in the coming days, weeks, as a consequence of what we're now seeing.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The level of destruction and killing during the holy month of Ramadan is horrific and inhumane. Yesterday, with colleagues from this House, I met with Palestinian students studying in the UK. One did not know if her family members were alive or not. Another could not attend because she just heard her father was killed the night before. So we must ensure the international community works together to outline the consequences for the Israeli government of these attacks. And can I ask the Secretary of State to confirm that the UK government will abide by any rulings of the ICJ regarding breaches of international humanitarian law in the region?
Can I reassure the Honourable Lady that yes, we will?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Over 400 killed, the majority children. Aid supplies blocked, aid workers killed, and rhetoric from Israeli ministers getting worse. All this under a ceasefire. I know these matters are complex, but at what point do we change our posture towards the Israeli government?
Well, I say to the Honourable Gentleman that we should remember when we're talking about Israel that we stand alongside the Israeli people at this time, and we're thinking of the many hostages who are underground and in desperate conditions in Gaza. Israel is a democracy, and that is why we see people taking to the streets, making their voices heard, and we see a heated debate within Israel as the best way forward.
MacDonald.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy
Yesterday, the International Development Select Committee returned from Geneva following the inquiry we're doing on international humanitarian law. The message was very clear. The IHL framework is robust. It is the adherence and compliance where we are failing. Under IHL, aid workers should be protected, and I welcome what the Foreign Secretary has said so far, but the deadly toll continues to rise in Gaza, and most of those workers are local. So can I ask the Foreign Secretary to expand on what we will be doing to protect aid workers, including through the Ministerial Group for the Protection of Humanitarian Personnel, and we met representatives from yesterday.
Well, I'm very grateful for what the Honourable Lady has raised. We continue to work with UN colleagues to coordinate to ensure that aid workers are protected. We continue to work with our EU colleagues to ensure that aid workers are protected. We condemn the tremendous loss of life in the worst conflict for aid workers, and we continue to call for justice, particularly for those killed in the World Central Kitchen, and for a proper investigatory process in Israel that sees accountability for those acts.
Patricia Ferguson.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and may I thank the Foreign Secretary for his statement today and for all the work that he and his team have been doing over so many months to try to find a resolution. The actions of Hamas are both brutal and unacceptable, but for a democratically elected government to bombard innocent civilians, deprive them of food and water and medical supplies is totally reprehensible. The Foreign Secretary is quite right to say that language and words are the language of diplomacy, but sometimes symbols matter too. So at a time when fears that the ground invasion by Israel is an attempt to separate the north from the south and to lead to annexation, is it not time that we do recognise the state of Palestine and show by that that we stand with the people of Palestine?
Well, can I say to the Honourable Lady, I recognise the strength at which these feelings are held in this House, and that we do want to see a home for the Palestinian people that's safe and secure alongside Israel. But as I've said to her before, we keep this issue under review. We work with close allies like France on these issues. And my own judgment is the moment is right when there is a process, and a process that actually leads to that two states. I had hoped, as a result of the ceasefire back in January and getting to phase 2, 3, that we were getting close to that process, and I will do everything I can to get us back to that place in the coming days.
Rutland.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Like many, I was horrified to see the resumption of airstrikes in Gaza and the loss of so many innocent lives this week. Civilians in Gaza and the remaining Israeli hostages who were abducted in the appalling Hamas terror attacks of October 7th desperately need to see a ceasefire back in place and hostages released. So will the Foreign Secretary join me in condemning comments from the Israeli Defence Minister threatening the total destruction of Gaza, whilst also being clear that the terrorists of Hamas can have no role in the future of Gaza?
Yes, I will.
Kirstine Sullivan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State for his statement today and his relentless efforts to bring all parties back to the negotiating table. I think we've all been horrified by the scenes that we've seen on TV, the resumption of violence that has seen the loss of hundreds of innocent lives, and indeed the blockade of life-saving aid. And we must never forget the hostages who are waiting to come home and their families who are waiting on them, and the horrors that they have experienced. But given the many emails of concern that I have received from my constituents, I must say that people are now asking, what next? What next? Because we have seen that throughout all these efforts, we have reached a point of utter desperation and hopelessness. Can he give assurances that arms licences will continue to be under regular review and that sanctions will be actively considered, and hopefully those measures will bring people back to the peace table?
Arms licences are continually reviewed, of course, and as she would expect, we always keep sanctions under review.
Sarah Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In recent days, nearly 1,000 Palestinians have been killed or injured, and once again, many more are being displaced. The humanitarian situation is getting worse in Gaza as Israel refuses to let the aid trucks through. It's now been 18 continuous days where the crossings have been closed, and this is surely a breach of international law. More than 1 million people have been left without food parcels, with 1 in 5 pregnant breastfeeding mothers malnourished. We need to see a return to the ceasefire and the return of the hostages. But the actions in the last week demand the UK government to take further action. Israel continued to breach the terms of the ceasefire, and while the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians is a real possibility, we should not do a trade deal with Israel. I urge the Minister to consider sanctions against some of the key Israeli actions. Can the Foreign Secretary confirm what further actions he will be taking in light of these recent escalations?
Well, much of what she raises has been dealt with me at the dispatch box, but let me say, although the UK has differences with the Israeli government, we do not with the Israeli people. And the Secretary of State for Business and Trade has taken the decision to restart negotiations on a free trade arrangement with Israel. There has not been any ministerial meetings, but it's important that we don't act in a way that is against the people of Israel, many of whom are taken to the streets at this very time.
Douglas McAllister.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Bombing civilians and preventing access to basic humanitarian supplies as a tactic of war is a war crime. I thank the Foreign Secretary for his statement and for his work for his tireless diplomacy. A call for a full, transparent investigation is welcome, as is a call to return to a ceasefire. But our strong opposition to the return of hostilities, the bombing by Israel, must now go beyond persuasion. Their actions are incompatible with international law. Is it not time to take a direct response beyond persuasion? Can I ask the Foreign Secretary, what stronger options does the government have before it to assist diplomacy? I know he can't speak about specifics, but can he confirm to the House that these are being considered to send a clear message now and to help stop the bloodshed?
Well, as a permanent 5 member of the UN Security Council, of course we've got an arsenal of diplomatic tools which we deploy as appropriate and keep under review. And I'd want to reassure the Honourable Gentleman we are doing everything we can to get back to that ceasefire.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Many of my constituents in West Brom have been in touch in recent days to express their horror and their devastation at the loss of life in Gaza after Israel resumed the bombing. The Foreign Secretary is absolutely right to say that diplomacy is the only way to end the bloodshed, but can I push him on the resumption of humanitarian aid? It's unacceptable that we have a continued block. What levers do we have to get Israel to end the block on aid, and what is the likelihood of aid coming in the coming days?
Well, I know the Honourable Lady's constituency well, and I can imagine that her constituents are meeting what they're seeing with real horror at this time. You know, there was a lot of debate about the humanitarian aid and the inability to get aid in and the barriers to getting aid in that I heard from some colleagues in Israel. And we got to that ceasefire, and the number of trucks crossing exceeded expectations, and the aid suddenly got in. It's now been, I think, 16, 17 days since the aid stopped, and there will be tremendous suffering as a result. Aid should never be used as a tool in any conflict, and that's why we want to see the resumption of aid. We now know how many trucks can get in. Let us get back to those numbers.
Question, Polly Billington.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I would like to commend my right honourable friend for all of the hard work that he has done in order to be able to secure the ceasefire in Gaza, and indeed for maintaining accountability to this House, as he has done today in so much detail. It is devastating that Israel has resumed the indiscriminate bombing of Palestinian civilians. While that ceasefire held, there were discussions from the Treasury bench about the possibility of a trade deal between the UK and Israel. Surely the Foreign Secretary agrees with me that now that ceasefire is over, a trade deal between the UK and Israel must be completely out of the question.
Well, the Honourable Lady has made her views known. There haven't actually been any ministerial meetings on any such trade deal. And I always want to keep in mind the Israeli people. Not, as it were, these are not governments, they're done on behalf of the people of Israel. But they will have heard, the whole House will have heard her remarks this afternoon.
That's the end of the statement on conflict in Gaza. We will now prepare for the select committee statements. Let the front benches swap over.